Hey, how's it going everyone? I'm White Pointer, and once again, it's time to tackle some questions from you guys, the viewers, about how classic games pulled off their graphical tricks. It's fantastic that these videos have been getting such a positive response, so let's keep the train moving and dissect some more games to answer your long-standing personal mysteries. Even if you didn't ask a question, maybe you've wondered the same thing as someone who has. As usual, why not try to guess the techniques as we go before the answer is revealed? Let's jump into it. As usual, we'll start with some Mega Drive games, and we'll kick off with one of its exclusive fighting games, Eternal Champions. AL Axel wants to know, how did the Genesis/Mega Drive version of Eternal Champions achieve its convincing transparency effects on some stages? Let's look into it and find out. So, Eternal Champions was developed and published by Sega themselves, and unlike most other fighting games at the time, it was made exclusively for home consoles, and wasn't an arcade game first, or ever. The question is asking about the transparency effects that we see in a few stages, like the fog in this one. Well, looking at it running in an emulator on a modern display like this, the method is pretty obvious. It's how the Mega Drive usually faked transparency or translucency, and that's with the use of dithering. You can see all the fog here is on the foreground plane, and is scrolling from right to left, independently of everything else. It's dithered to make it look like you can see through it, and is cycling through a couple of different colours to complete the effect. The buildings in the background and the fire are also cycling palettes to make it look like they're being illuminated. We see it applied in a slightly different way in this stage, with the clouds that are moving across the moon. Unlike the previous stage we looked at, where the moon was part of the background, in this case the moon is a low priority sprite, and parts of the clouds are dithered so the moon shines through as they move across it. What we see on this stage is slightly different again. It's still a form of dithering, just disguised a bit better. We can see the desert background through the windows, some of which are graded. In this case the windows are on the foreground plane, but are making heavy use of the first index in their palette, which is the colour assigned to be transparent, allowing you to completely see through those pixels as if they weren't there. The heat haze in the background is an effect created by combining horizontal and vertical scroll modes. Let's move on to another great Mega Drive exclusive, made by Treasure, and that's Gunstar Heroes, widely considered one of the best games on the console, and a few of you had questions about this one. The first one comes from Short Game Guide and Rafael Oliveira 17. They want to know how the mini-boss that seems to be made up of 3D boxes was done. Let's open it up to see what's inside. Alright, so here's the mini-boss they're talking about, called Bravo Man, which you can actually find about halfway through the first level, so you don't need to play too long to reach it. As you can see, its body is made up of what looks like 3D polygonal rotating cubes. It looks really cool and makes the boss stand out, and for the record, this is the same effect that's used later on in the game with the dice. Before I reveal the answer, pause the video and have a guess in the comments, then resume to see if you are right. Well, as you might have concluded, these are not actually real polygons, but if that's the case, then what are they? It's a really clever use of sprites. You see, each of these cubes is actually made up of 2D sprite tiles that have been animated to look like it's rotating, with each possible angle of the cube stored as a separate tile. But they only need to have one set of these in memory, as they just reuse those sprite tiles over and over again to make the 16 boxes that comprise the body. They are assembled in various orientations in order to create the humanoid shape, with one more unique one at the top to form the head. It's also overlapping the sprite tiles as the boss is moving, in order to make some appear behind and others in front, to create even more of an illusion of depth. It seems so incredibly uncomplicated that you might wonder why this kind of thing wasn't done more often, but you need to keep in mind that this works as well as it does because the segments that make up its body are simple rotating cubes, and it wouldn't look as good if the shapes were more complex. The other question about Gunstar Heroes was posted by Denny Lockman 1. How did they do the rotating boss? Let's spin it up to figure out how this neat visual trick was done. So this is it, the guard device, a boss fight you encounter late in the game. The main gimmick of this one is that it appears as though the core is in the centre of a rotating room. There's a lot going on with this, so let's unpack it all. So the centre core structure is actually on the foreground plane, and on the same layer as the platform the player stands on. This doesn't move, but is animated to look like it's spinning. The rest of the scene is made up of the background plane, and there's some fairly complex line scrolling going on here. The top and bottom portions that make up the ceiling and the floor move in a kind of parallelogram shape at opposite angles, while the middle portion simply scrolls a large chunk in one direction. You might also notice there's a part that's not moving at all, which is supposed to be the platform on the other side of the room. In addition to all of that, the boss has a kind of arm thing that's composed of ball shapes. These are all sprites that are moving at different rates, moving faster as they move down the length of the arm. These all use the fake scaling trick of flicking between different sizes of sprites as they get closer or further away, to make it look like it's really spinning around the room. The boss also periodically spawns robotic drones to attack, and these also swap between different sizes to make it look like they're coming out of the background. In the second phase of the fight, the arm is replaced by these blue balls that appear to be orbiting around the center core, but it's the same concept of using different sizes of sprites to fake the scaling. Finally, in the third phase of the fight, the balls turn green and take on a humanoid shape that appears to be running along the rotating floor, and once again, it's shifting between different sprite sizes to fake the scaling and make it look like it's moving closer or further away. Sprite tiles also overlap to create the animations, in the same concept that we saw earlier with the block mini-boss. The developers behind Gunstar Heroes, Treasure, really knew how to make the hardware sing, and their other games are also full of interesting effects, but we'll leave those for another time. Moving on, this next question is from Happy Space Invader 508 in regards to James Pond 3 Operation Starfish, specifically the Mega Drive version. They want to know how the spinning James Pond and how the Star Wars-like text scroll was done in the intro, and how the stretching effect of the bosses when you defeat them was done. Alright, let's dive in. So here's the tracked mode intro, which sees an image of James Pond rotating and scaling larger. If this was the Super Nintendo, this could easily be done in Mode 7. Though oddly enough, the Super Nintendo version uses Mode 7 for the company logos that appear when you first boot the game up, but doesn't try to replicate this animation at all, and just shows a still image, which is a bit strange. But this is the Mega Drive, which has no hardware support for rotational scaling, so how on earth is this happening? What's your guess on how this was done? Well, this is a pre-prepared animation where they've actually just brute forced it. If you take a look at the tiles that make up this scene, you'll see it's basically entirely comprised of tiles that make up James Pond in various sizes and orientations. It's basically redrawing the entire image once every 2 frames as he's spinning and zooming into the camera, quickly swapping between the different tile sizes as he gets larger, and because there's so many of them, it looks seamless. It's also all happening on the background planes. The sprite plane isn't being used here at all. It's kind of funny when you think about it. As you can see, they're using almost all the available tile memory to pull off this trick that only lasts a few seconds, which is why the rest of the screen space is just a completely black background colour. But they obviously thought it was worth it. A bit later in the tracked mode intro, there's this Star Wars-like scrolling text as the game is explaining the story setup. The text is scrolling up the screen and getting smaller as it moves away before disappearing, and is also changing colour. Once again, if we're talking about the Super Nintendo, this would be simple with Mode 7, and as a matter of fact, the Super Nintendo version does indeed use Mode 7 to make this effect, though without the change in colours. But how is this happening on the Mega Drive? There's actually a few components to this. Firstly, here are Plane A and Plane B, the foreground and background plane respectively. Plane A appears to be totally blank, while Plane B has the logo at the top and a coloured gradient underneath it. All the stars are sprites, and these are the only sprites in the scene. So where is that text coming from? As you might have guessed, it's coming from the foreground plane. We can't see it at the moment, but if we turn on transparent pixels instead of just using a black background colour, it becomes visible, and we can see exactly what it's doing. It's essentially using transparent pixels to cut holes in the foreground plane in the shape of the letters, so the text changes colour as it scrolls over the colour gradient of the background plane underneath it. You'll also notice this isn't scrolling like a normal plane either. It's instead an animated tile map. The size and shape of the transparent pixels that make up the letters are adjusting as the text is scrolling, to make it look like it's moving into the distance before it moves off the top of the tile map completely, which is when it disappears from the main game screen. It's a really creative solution to the problem. It's a commendable amount of effort to put into something like this that most players are probably only going to watch once and then not give it a second thought, but at least it's caught the attention of you guys and given us an interesting example to study. Onto when you defeat a boss, such as this guy, the Lumpsville Lurker, and the stretching effect that happens. The boss's body here is a background, not a sprite, and if you look at the effect closely, you'll notice it's only stretching vertically, not horizontally. So what's happening here is a raster effect that's vertically stretching the plane the boss is on, which is a capability of the hardware I've covered several times in these videos. It's basically the same technique we see used in this example from Alien Soldier, except in Alien Soldier's case it's much more conservative. James Pond 3 takes it to the absolute extreme to really exaggerate it. If you're enjoying this content and would like to see more of it, make sure you subscribe so you know when I upload new videos. This next one isn't so much a question, but rather a request for clarification, and it's come from two commenters, Extreme Rec and Zethron91. They both mentioned that in one of his recent videos, Chiropoulos wasn't quite sure how they were doing the transparent effect on the bike's windshield in Kawasaki Superbike Challenge. Let's see if we can ride our way to a definitive answer to this. So here's the game running, and what we are concentrating on for the purpose of this video is the player's tinted windscreen on the front of the motorbike. Like these guys asking the question, and perhaps like you as well, I saw that video by Chiropoulos, and he says he thinks it was shadow mode, but was puzzled by it because he wasn't aware it could be applied to such a small irregular shaped area of the screen. He went on to say he was struggling to track down exactly how it worked, as he couldn't find an emulator with comprehensive enough debugging tools. Well, I do happen to have an emulator with debugging tools that can help us figure this out, so let's solve the mystery for our good friend Chiropoulos. Make sure you go and check out his channel if you haven't already, by the way. Firstly, he was correct that it's using shadow and highlight mode. Now, before I go further with this, if you aren't aware of how this feature works, I would advise you to go and watch my video where I did an in-depth technical analysis of exactly how this special mode functions and what it does and doesn't do, because you'll likely need that background knowledge in order to fully understand this explanation. As I elaborate on in that video, the mode functions differently depending on whether it's used on backgrounds or sprites. Only shadow mode can be applied to backgrounds, and depends on the priority system, while both shadow and highlight can be applied to sprites, and it depends on the colour palettes. In this case, the player's bike here is made up of sprites. When it's applied to sprites, it doesn't make the sprite itself shadowed or highlighted, but rather the background tiles behind it on the affected pixels. The 15th colour, or index E, in the last palette is assigned to be the highlight colour, and the 16th colour, or index F, is assigned to be the shadow colour. And in order to use shadow and highlight mode, the sprite needs to be using one or both of these colours somewhere, depending on what effect is wanted. These colours display normally when shadow and highlight mode is off, but when the mode is turned on, it doesn't matter what those colours are, they become highlight and shadow, and neither brighten or darken the background pixels behind them. If we use debug tools to turn shadow and highlight off in Kawasaki Superbike Challenge, this is demonstrated quite nicely. With the mode disabled, we can see that the majority of the windscreen, apart from the small curved line of pixels that makes up the top frame, is using the last colour of the last palette, index F of palette 3. In this case, it's a solid dark purple. When shadow and highlight mode is turned on, every pixel in the sprite that is using this colour index then becomes shadowed, tinting the background pixels behind it. It's not using the red that's assigned to index E, but if it was, then those pixels would also highlight the background pixels behind them. So there you go, that's how the effect was done. And Chiropoulos, if you watch this, I think you owe me a beer. Time to move on to the Super Nintendo, and the first question comes from Beef Jerky in regards to Battletoads and Battlemaniacs. This is a game I hold pretty close to my heart, as it was a favourite of mine growing up, and I'm still able to beat it without losing a single life. The question's asking me to take a look at the intro, which had a rotating and scaling helicopter on top of a fairly detailed background. It even seemed to emerge from between layers when it appeared. Let's hop to it. So this is the part of the intro that the question is asking about, which starts with these mountains, and then the Battletoads' helicopter appears out from behind one of them and flies towards the camera. It's only a really brief shot before it transitions to another one, so let's slow it down and take a closer look at it. If we disable all the layers so we are just left with the background colour, we can see it's actually made up of two gradients. an orange-red one for the sunset sky, and the blue one which is used for the lake. There's also a black area in the middle. The mountains and trees that form the rest of the scenery here are not background tile maps though, they are entirely made up of sprites, and they are initially set to a pretty high priority. However, take a look at this sprite tile here. It's almost entirely made up of the colour assigned to be transparent, showing only the background colour behind it, which we saw earlier is entirely black, cleverly disguised as the mountain's shadow. When the copter appears from behind the mountain on the right of the screen, it flies in front of this tile, so it's not covered up by the rest of the scenery. At this point, once it's in full view, all of the sprite tiles making up the scenery change to low priority, so they then appear behind the chopper for the remainder of the shot. The helicopter itself is honestly the least complicated part of this. As you have probably deduced because it's pretty obvious, this is a Mode 7 background. On the subject of helicopters, Jason Blarlock4429 has questions about what's going on in the intro cutscene to Jurassic Park 2 The Chaos Continues. I showed this cutscene as part of my video about the Super Nintendo's transparency effects, and he wants to know how the choppers are seemingly scaling and moving at different rates, even overlapping at some points. So, the first shot here is these two helicopters flying towards the island, both of them scaling as they do so. First things first, just like what we saw with Battletoads, the majority of the scenery here is actually made up of sprites, including the island in the background and the clouds. Only the shimmering water at the bottom of the screen is actually a background tile map, and the choppers are all Mode 7. The first one flies in from the left and scales smaller, then another one follows it. This second one is done with a screen split here on scanline 46, and in this case it's using the same Mode 7 tile map in both the upper and lower segments. You'll notice the second copter is at a higher altitude to the first, and they never cross over each other. This is why. If you watch the scene closely, there's also a third helicopter that very briefly appears from the right. Blink and you'll miss it, even in slow motion. That's on a different part of the Mode 7 tile map. It's a unique image as this one is shown at a different angle to the others. It's on screen so briefly that I'm not entirely sure why they bothered, but it's there. The second shot, however, of these four helicopters has nothing special going on. These are all just sprites, and none of them are actually scaling. They're just moving up and across the screen at slightly different rates. Finally, there's this shot of the helicopters flying over the jungle. The background here is made up of regular tile maps. The game is using Mode 1 here. The choppers here are sprites, and in order to make them smaller as they fly away, they are using good old-fashioned fake scaling by swapping in different sizes. Running at full speed, it's almost invisible to the naked eye, but you can see it pretty clearly if you slow it down, and we can confirm it by checking the sprite tiles in memory. Next up, Pirate Sephiroth has a question about Mega Man X. They want to know how Sting Chameleon's camouflage effect was done. Let's see if we can see what's going on here. Okay, that pun was pretty lame. So here's the Sting Chameleon fight, and once again, there's a few components to unpack with this. Let's start first of all with how Sting Chameleon is going camo and blending in with the background. If we study the colour palettes being used here, he's using palette D. Going back to my video about the SNES's transparency effects, we know that this is one of the sprite palettes that colour masks could be applied to for transparency effects. It's worth noting that Mega Man is using palette 9, one of the sprite palettes that is not affected by colour maths. But the game is doing something unique here. Watch what happens when he does his disappearing trick. The entire palette, all 16 colours, are gradually swapped out for black. What this means is that instead of still being partially visible and see-through like a ghost when colour maths is applied, he's almost vanishing against the background. The second half of the effect is the shimmer that occurs when he phases in and out, and as he moves around while camouflaged. This is also interesting. The subscreen contains a copy of the background, and you can see there's a line scrolling effect being used on it to warp it with a wave pattern. This is what's used by the colour math circuit to calculate the transparency, which creates the shimmer effect. You can see that the wave animation on the subscreen only happens while he's phasing in or out, but while he's invisible, it remains as a static warped image. This juxtaposition of the main and subscreen images is how that cloaking-like trick is achieved, and why you can just barely make out where he's moving while he's camouflaged. Capcom was some of the masters of this type of thing, but it wasn't just them. HAL Labs used the exact same technique in Kirby Superstar. I bring this up because Henky37 wants to know about the Chameleon boss, named Chameleon Arm, who shows up a few times in the collection of games on the cartridge. I'll only cover the SNES original here and not the DS version, as the DS is outside the scope of this video. This is the encounter with Chameleon Arm during the Great Cave Offensive, and periodically during the fight, he does the same vanishing act of blending into the background, leaving just a blurred shape that you can barely see to track where he's going. Like Stink Chameleon, he's using one of the sprite palettes that support colour maths. In this case, it's palette E, and once again, every colour gradually turns black as he camouflages. The shimmering effect on the subscreen is a bit different here. Instead of creating a wave pattern, segments of the background shift up and down a bit, resulting in a slightly different blur to what we just saw in Mega Man X. But aside from that, the actual method used here is identical. The other slight difference is that he swaps his colour palette when he phases back in, which isn't technically impressive nor difficult, but is a nice little touch that gives him a bit of personality. The last game I'll cover in this video is the incredible Japanese exclusive RPG Star Ocean, as C4 Plays would like to know how the developers, Tri-Ace, were able to do sprite scaling. The dozens of different items and equipment found in treasure chests scale in size when you open them up. Surely they didn't just make hundreds of animations for such a simple effect. Well, let's find out.
And don't call me Shirley.
You might remember Star Ocean from the video I made about the Super Nintendo's enhancement chips, as this was one of only 2 games to use the SDD1 compression chip for its graphics data, allowing it to squeeze way more onto the cartridge than would otherwise be possible. This is a huge, expansive adventure, but luckily we don't need to play for very long to see what the question is asking about. There's a few chests in the very first room you start the game in actually, and after only a short dialogue scene, you're outside battling enemies that will drop chests when they are defeated. When you open a chest, the item pops out and grows up to its full size, before shrinking back down and disappearing. It's a pretty quick animation, but it's noticeable and a neat little unique touch in the game. So how do you think this is being done? Have a guess and then continue to see if you are right. First of all, these items are indeed sprites, but it's also not using the fake scaling trick of swapping in different sizes that we've seen plenty of times before, including earlier in this video. No, this method is more sophisticated than that. Let's isolate the sprite tiles and slow it right down. Firstly, we can see it's pulling the same trick that we saw Art of Fighting doing in the previous video. That is, it's overlapping sprite tiles. In this case, they are starting overlapped, then moving out until they aren't, then reversing that when they shrink back down. But that's not all, something else is happening. Look at the sprite tiles closely. Yes, these are software scaling, pixel by pixel in real time. We can tell this because there's no other sizes of the sprite tiles preloaded into memory like we've seen in previous examples. I'm not 100% sure exactly how they are doing this, but my guess is that the sprites are stored in their largest size, then they scaled smaller and restored using a simple linear or nearest neighbour scaling algorithm, as these would be the least CPU intensive. Despite that, you'll notice there's really nothing much else happening on screen when this is taking place, aside from maybe some background animations. This is probably deliberate. Star Ocean wasn't the only game to pull this trick, but in general it was pretty rare to see, and it's just one little part of one of the best looking 16-bit games ever made. It's an enormous game, weighing in at a massive 48 megabits, tying with Tales of Phantasia as the biggest commercial game ever released for the platform, and that's compressed with the impressive SDD1 chip. Fully decompressed, it's actually twice that size at 96 megabits, which is mind-boggling. If you ever get the chance to play it, you definitely should, and there's a high quality fan-made English translation patch that's been available for about 20 years now. The only other game to use this chip was Street Fighter Alpha 2. It never ceases to impress me how developers managed to really push the hardware in ways never thought originally possible back then. Some of these techniques were actually pretty difficult for me to figure out, which makes me appreciate them even more, and to a degree, makes me wonder how they came up with these solutions in the first place. Hopefully, as you guys watch these videos and go on the journey of discovery with me, you come to the same appreciation. Thanks so much for your comments and keep the questions coming. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video, it really helps a lot, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my content. Thanks for watching and see you next time. Haha, still got it.